I remember the day the stone arrived because the room smelled like rain even though the sun was hammering the street outside. You know that smell rocks get when you wet them, like old chalk and wet tin? The whole place breathed it, like the fossils were the thing alive and the city outside was the stuff that died and dried up. Dr. Raymond said I was only to stand and watch and pass him the knife when he asked and the plaster when he said so, and not to touch anything unless he put it in my palm as if it were a bird. I stood on a crate that had once been full of oranges and pressed my hands on the edge of the table to see better. My hands were small enough to slide between anything. He always said I was useful for that. Johannesburg was hot that Saturday. The jacarandas had given up their purple weeks ago, and the leaves were grey with dust. We had ride-worn men flustered in hats and collars on the street outside, heading to weddings and to the market, the tram bells dinging like spoons hitting cups. Inside, in Dr. Raymond's rooms at the university, the light was a calm sort of yellow. There was a skeleton hanging by the window with its feet turned in a shy way. The skull had a screw on top and a string that swung, and the teeth were all there, proper and human, which made me feel watched but not minded. The jars of formalin were not my favorite. If you tipped your head the light caught them and put everything inside in slices. The doctor's waistcoat was buttoned high and wrong for the heat, but he didn't notice temperature when he had stone in his fingers. He picked up the new piece as if it might laugh at him. The rock was honey-colored like the brittle toffee I once made with sugar that went too far, and there were bits that glittered, and parts softer with fossil sand. Breccia, he told me the first time a crate came from Tong. Cemented stuff. Old caves collapsed, carried by water, set like plaster. He showed me with his fingers, and his hands had a chalk line along the creases that never seemed to wash away entirely. When he ran the knife, it wasn't really a knife but a sort of curved thing that could whisper away hard edges. He leaned and breathed with it, and he breathed through his nose when he wanted to be still. I had a rag in my pocket to wipe my own nose because the dust made me sneeze sometimes. That morning, I had been sent to fetch a little parcel of biscuits from my aunt across town, and when I came back the doctor was still in his black jacket even though he was meant to be getting ready to be a best man at a wedding. He had opened his collar but not the top button of his stiff shirt because he said he hated looking like a man not ready. The crate had come while he stood in our doorway, his hair neat, and his friend outside shouting about flowers and the minister. And there the crate sat, with the planks bristling a bit and the string dug into it like it hurt the wood. "Bring the chisel," he said to me, his voice with its slow vowels that I liked because it meant he had come from very far, on ships and trains, and had chosen to be here with us. He smiled sideways when he said to me, "Just for a minute, Tommy," because I had said I would not stand between a man and his appointment with love. He laughed at that, which is how I know it was a good joke, and we found the drawer with the chisels and the little mallet. He pried and I wiped the white dust from the lip where the lid gave a sigh like a book you open after years. Inside were lumps. The quarry had sent them wrapped in newspaper. When you touched the paper it sucked against your fingers like wet cloth, even though it was dry, and it left smudges. We unwrapped them and set them in a row. The doctor moved one aside and pulled the next as if he were choosing plums. He held one up to the light and I saw the shadow of something inside the rock like a fish hidden in bread. He frowned. He set it down. He reached for another. There were tags tied to some with twine, numbers, and letters I wasn't allowed to mix up. He told me the words again and I let them sit on my tongue like sweets: endocast, foramen magnum, sutures, breccia, Tong. In the hallway, someone called his name with a voice that echoed like it was inside a jar. He pretended not to hear. He found a piece with a shape to it, as if the stone had once been poured around a soap and the soap melted away. He wetted it with water, not much, just a flick of his fingers, and the dark bled through the honey color and showed ridges. "Do you see?" he said, and I didn't see, not then, only the shine and a half-smoothness that reminded me of the inside of a seashell. He raised his eyebrows and brought it closer to my eyes. I am not shy about saying when I don't understand, and I shook my head and watched his mouth draw into a line like a tight string. "Brain," he said softly. "This is the inside of a brain. The mold of the space the brain once sat. Can you believe that?" I said I could if he could. He liked that answer and patted my shoulder. He showed me a bump and called it something Latin, and I forgot it then, but I remember it now because he said it so many times that week that it wore grooves in my mind like a wheel. Lunate sulcus. He made his fingers into a C shape and pressed them against air. His shirt had a dot of water where he had leaned too close to the basin. He used a feather to wipe dust and then his breath to cloud the place and show a line. He did an odd little shuffle sometimes when he was excited, as if music was playing inside his bones and he couldn't hold still, and I copied it without thinking, which made him laugh and say I was his shadow. He set that piece down as if it slept and picked up another, and then he held one that had a smoothness to it that wasn't any stone smoothness. He made a sound in his throat that I want to call "oh" even now, and I leaned forward and saw teeth. Teeth in a rock. I know teeth. I had a loose one that summer and I wiggled it with my tongue and tapped it silently with my fingernail during lessons because I liked how thin the sound was. These teeth were not like mine exactly. They were small and tight and honest. The doctor forgot about the wedding entirely, and his friend in the doorway stopped calling and came in to look and then said, in a tone I will tell you I understood even as a boy, "Ray, if you will miss my wedding for a rock, you had better be right about that rock." The doctor didn't answer. He was right in the middle of the word right and somewhere between rock and luck and look, and he took the little knife and he moved as if writing his name. He had strong wrists but careful hands. I held my breath because when I breathed the dust went in and stuck to everything behind my nose and it made me sneeze and make a noise like a cat when you step on its tail. He brushed and the shape of a small face slid out of the stone, dome of a forehead, sockets where eyes would be. Not even the skeleton in the corner stared that much. I am telling you about a skull because that is what it was, and because my head filled with the twin feelings of knowing and not knowing at once. He said it could be a child. I know children, I am one. But this child had a jaw with little teeth that were not sharp and cruel like a carnivore and not a big machine like a cow's. They were like mine for chewing everything. The place where the big hole should be, the hole at the bottom of the skull where your spine goes, I can say foramen magnum now without thinking, was not at the back like in a dog or a baboon that walks on all fours. It was more under, like in the skeleton near the window. The doctor just kept saying look. Look, as if more eyes would make more rightness. He did go to the wedding, finally, late and with his hair moved from one side to the other by the wind he made walking fast. He changed his collar in the hallway and I saw the raw place under his chin where the razor had caught, and I thought of how bones have lines too, where something came apart and healed again. He whispered to Mother that the child would change how people think of us, and that was a big promise to pour into a kitchen, even our kitchen with the yellow walls and the lace curtain made by my aunt with a pattern of leaves she swore were fig but to me looked like the hands of a lady with rings. My mother patted his arm and put the good napkin in his pocket. He laughed, because he didn't know where to put it there among his chalks. He smelled like rain again when he left. After he went I stood very still in the lab so that the little things wouldn't shift, and I listened to the slow tick of the clock. We didn't wind enough. The skeleton made the faint sound a rope makes when it twists a little and settles, and outside in the street a car backfired. The stone with the little face seemed to be looking sideways at me. I tried to make my face look back exactly the same, and I discovered the muscles you don't know until you try them. I talked to it in a whisper. "Do you see me?" I asked. It did not answer, which is the right kind of not answer for stone. Before the doctor came to work at the university, I had liked bones already. I liked the engineering of them. My father said bones are the beams you can't see that keep a house from falling. He was not talking about skeletons then. He was a railway man and he used beams for many things. He was a quiet sort, but when he did talk he had a way of cutting through the meat of it. He was away a lot, out near the places where the ground lies thin and dusty and tries to get into your teeth when you sleep. He sent me a folded letter once with 3 lines only: "Be good to your mother. Keep your chin up. Remember the road is long, so keep your eyes on your feet as much as the horizon." I liked the last line because it sounded like a thing that would keep you balanced. He came home smelling like oil and smoke and wool and sometimes lime if he had been near a quarry. Lime is a taste you get long after, in your tongue's memory. Our street had a hawker who pushed a cart with oranges so bright you wanted to cup them in both hands and pretend they were lamps, and a man who mended pots and who could whistle like a lark. The tram ran close, and when the bell rang the sound went through your bones the way certain notes from a violin can go, like a small hammer tapping your marrow. The nights were thin then, with the stars so many it wasn't a sky but a net. Mother would sit with her mending in the doorway when the heat forgot to leave the house with us, and she'd put her ear to the street not for danger but for the sound of something coming home. Sometimes I would sit with her and scratch the dry mud from my kneecaps with my thumb and count cars. In our kitchen we had a jar of sugar you weren't allowed to dip in when you wanted to. I did anyway with my fingers as quick as lizards. The sugar clumped because of the damp and felt like pills. When the doctor asked if I wanted to go with him to the place the stones came from, I said yes so fast that my mouth got ahead of my chest. He said, "Don't tell your mother I put such silliness into your head. We will do it properly with letters." He called me my young assistant in the letter because he liked to be proper on paper. Mother read it and held it between 2 fingers as if the paper might drip. She almost smiled. She said it would be good for me to see the country that made the wind that came through our windows. She said, "Bring your hat back with you, because I never keep hats." The doctor smiled and shook his head and told me to roll my socks up tight and tie them with string. He did not like suitcases. He liked old tea tins for his small things and a satchel for his papers. We went by train as far as we could. The bench was wooden and left stripes on the backs of our legs. The mountains in the distance were a law someone had written unevenly. The veldt was the emptiest thing I had ever seen, and yet it was full of noises and small things. Termite mounds like little castles. The sky was too big for one pair of eyes. I stretched my neck as if that would help. Farmers at stations with dust embedded right into their eyelids stood and didn't hurry even if the whistle blew, and women in headcloths held babies whose hairlines were perfect like painted pictures and who blinked at us as if we were something to puzzle at, a string of metal with a smell like a storm and hot iron. We changed to a lorry with wheels that made their own paths. The quarry was a white wound in the ground, soft around the edges with scrapped powder. Men in hats you couldn't tell the color of because everything was so bleached moved along the benches of rock and shouted to each other and tried not to swallow the morning. There were piles of stone that looked like broken loaves and piles that looked like a shop's window of sweets, hard and sticky looking. There were wire sieves and buckets and small hammers and big hammers. Someone had hung a jacket on a nail in the shade of a piece of cliff and the sleeve hung as if a person still wore it and had one arm to ask a question with and one arm missing entirely. "Du Mailang," the doctor said to a group of older men under a wind pump, careful with his mouth around the sounds. He tried to learn people's words and not only their bones. The men laughed not to be unkind but because it's a good sound to make when a visitor tries. A boy around my size, he told me his name was Toomey, which is the roundest name my mouth ever said, stood with a stick and one bare foot curved around it. He had a shirt with 3 buttons and only one buttoned, and a stance that made you think of goats on rock. He kept not looking at me in a way that was looking, and when I did a small leap down from a ledge that made dust, he threw a tin can at an even smaller rock and knocked it for 6 just because he thought it would impress me. It did. The quarry manager had a red neck and a way of folding his lips when he didn't like something. But he shook the doctor's hand as if they were old friends and showed us the place where they had hit a seam of bone. The doctor's eyes are like that, always working, the way a dog's ears can pick a far sound. He asked about water and how it had flowed in the cave and where the mud went. The manager pointed with a finger that had a crack along the nail so wide I worried his whole hand would eventually become a map of the Karoo if he didn't take care. The doctor crouched and picked up a piece of stone the way you pick up a baby, with both hands but only touching it really with the softest parts of your fingers. The men drilled holes and set charges. I put my fingers in my ears and still the crack went through the middle of my head like lightning, pretending it had found a way to be a sound. Chunks fell and bounced, and somebody's hat ran away a little. When the dust stopped acting like a living creature, we went and looked at the new face of stone. Toomey showed me where in the spill the little vertebrae come sometimes, and the roots of the ancient trees like strange bones themselves. He had a hand lens made from a broken bottle bottom that he used as if it were an instrument. He found a tiny rabbit jaw and handed it to me like a gift you might pull from deep in your pocket. We workers all had our ways of being in that white bowl. Some wore cloths over the mouth, others chewed gum, others spat now and then. The older men said not to sit down on your haunches too long or you'd forget how to stand up, which is how they made jokes when their backs hurt. The sun straight above, the wind when it came tasting like it had been over metal and dry grass. The doctor set up a little table with a camp stool and laid out his implements in a row like a soldier would lay his rifles. The cloth for his hands, the brush with camel hair, the dental picks, his notebook with its pages already bored into by the pencil and the lines of his thought. If he wrote something down it stayed written. That is a kind of sorcery I want to learn and one reason I started this practice of telling. At midday the quarry quieted for a bit, and everyone found their shade somewhere. I ate a crust of bread and some biltong and a piece of peach mother had put in a jar for me and wrapped with my socks so it wouldn't break. The peach was sweeter because it had thought about breaking and decided against it. Toomey had a small packet of ground peanuts and mealy crumbs and he showed me how to roll them into a ball with a bit of water and how to eat it slowly, pinching little bits like a fairy goat. We drank water that had a taste of rust and clay. He told me his uncle worked for the stone men and how he himself wanted to learn how to fix the wind pump because it made music when it wanted and because things that make music deserve love. I told him about a skeleton that lived in a room and the time the doctor put my hand on the place where the neck plugs into the head and said, "There. Listen to that." "You can listen to a bone?" he asked. "Yes," I said, and then, because it is an odd thing to say and I didn't want him to think me a liar, I added, "Not with your ears. The listening is a finger thing." He nodded as if this made all the sense. He had a way of nodding that made you feel agreed with even if you hadn't quite arranged your thoughts yet. He showed me a trick of knuckling rock that makes you know if there's a hollow inside. He said his grandmother could listen with her heel to the ground to tell if cattle were where they should be. I told him I would like to meet a grandmother who could do that, and he said, "You should like to meet my grandmother for many reasons." I couldn't stop thinking of the little face in stone back in Johannesburg. When the doctor called me over, I kept comparing every chip we turned to that. A fly landed on my ear and I tried to ignore it because there's a pride in not letting a fly win. The doctor passed his finger over another lump and squinted. "Look here," he said to the manager, to me, to the air. He sees what he sees and then he teaches it. That is another skill I wish to learn. He told the men what to bring him and he told me where to stand, which is almost as good as being told what to do. Before I slept that night on a mattress that had grass in it, I lay on my back and held my hands up toward the roof and made them into shapes. I can make elephants and birds with my hands when there is a lamp behind them, and the shadows are better than the hands themselves, the same way sometimes the shape inside the rock is better than the rock. I thought of the word the doctor had used, Australopithecus, and I said it softly and laughed because it sounds like a word someone invented to see if your tongue could make a knot. He told me it means southern ape, because we are in the south and because the little skull had ape in it but also human. I asked him which bits were which and he said he didn't want to separate the child just yet. Later I learned he meant that the human part was in the walking and the face and the brain's folds and even in the way the skull had held life, not just the bits you could label in a book. In the morning, when it was cold in the way only mornings can be when you've had a day in heat, we went back to the lip and looked across the quiet place that the blast hadn't reached, because you choose where to break and where to leave, and the leaving is as important as the breaking. There were swallows in a line like notes on a wire. The doctor blew on his tea and the steam made a man on his cup look like he had hair. He told me about when he first learned bones and how he had wanted to be a doctor of hearts at first but then found that he liked the idea of people's oldest selves even more. He smiled and I thought the word oldest selves was the good kind of foolish, like believing the fish under the water are butterflies half of the day. We had a visitor that afternoon, a woman with a scarf tied over her hair and a baby on her hip that chewed its knuckles and stared with eyes that did not ever stop. Her voice had gravel in it. She told us about a place beyond the ridge where she said the water had once stood and where her grandfather had taken her when she was small to find shells that didn't belong to the present. I heard that and thought of my box at home, the one that held bottle caps and a nail bent like a question mark and my lucky marble and a piece of red glass that was not a jewel but felt like one. I like the idea of keeping parts of the other times in a box where you can find them again. The woman's baby reached for my hair and the baby smelled like milk and dust and her forehead had a tiny scar that made me think of how a line can make something more interesting than if it were smooth. We walked with her beyond the ridge. The flat spread out and shimmered. In certain light the world looks like a lie you can believe in. The doctor crouched now and then and picked up something and either smiled and put it in his pocket or shook his head and tossed it aside gently, as if even a wrong thing deserved being put down softly. To me and I chased a lizard that had pretended to be a stick and then remembered its tail. The woman set her baby down and the baby found white pebbles and made a pile and then knocked it down. The doctor told me, we are all making piles and knocking them down, and he meant a joke but also not a joke, and I loved him for being like that. On the way back, we stopped at a place where a fig tree had decided to grow out of a cliff. It was impossible, which is the best kind of thing to watch, because roots can be clever like that, finding the cracks, making more space when there is none. The doctor put his hand where the roots and stone met and closed his eyes. He may have prayed. I don't know. He is the sort of man who would apologize to a tree for the trouble of being a mystery. He opened his eyes and saw me watching and winked. Your mother might not forgive me for bringing you back with white hair, he said. I told him my hair was already changing because of my ideas and he laughed and told me to watch for snakes. There was a menagerie that came through town sometimes, when it was not too far from the track and there was money in it. They had monkeys and a baboon and a leopard that looked at you as if it kept you in its pocket already. Once my father took me on a Sunday and we stood under the tent with the smell of animals plotting. The keeper told a story about a man who had raised a baboon like a boy and how the boy had learned how to sit at a table and eat porridge with a spoon. The baboon was right there, in a collar, and his hands were human enough that I felt guilty about how we had made him look like a clown. I stared at his feet and how his thumb toes could grip rope as if rope wanted to be his friend. When the doctor held the little skull, I thought of the baboon and how he looked not like us and yet like us. I looked at my own hands and turned them over and over as if the lines would give me dates. A week after we came back, there was a meeting. The big room at the university filled with men who wore their collars too tight and with women who did not like to be hot in public. The doctor had polished his shoes and his skull. He had words that day that he had saved like coins and he spent them. He told them about the hole under the skull and the way teeth can tell you not only what someone ate but how they bit and what they saved for later. He held up the endo cast, a word that still feels like a stone in the mouth, and he showed his treasure. He didn't shout. He never shouts. He put the facts on the table like bread. He said, "Here, take, eat," in a manner of speaking, and some did and some chewed and said it was stale. A man with a mustache that meant he wasn't very comfortable joined with the other men in the way questions circle. He asked if perhaps the skull belonged to an ape that had died and then drifted to the bottom of a hole and got stuck with weird mud, or whether a child that had fallen in had hit his head and been bitten by an animal and whether that made his bones look odd. The doctor said that all of that is possible and still your eyes can count. He said the roots of the teeth were what they were and the hole at the bottom was where it was. Those things you cannot move by asking. He used a stick to point and the stick shook a little because his hand was tired from the week, I think, not from fear. I sat very straight and thought if I were a man I would stand and clap then. Afterwards, in the corridor where people always speak their truest untruths and untruest truths, a man said to me, "You like this, do you, like a challenge?" I said I liked any day where a piece of stone taught us a new way to be. He made a face as if I had said something like I like eating porridge with pepper. He said, "Our people do not come from apes, boy." I said, I didn't know apes were giving out themselves like that. I thought stones were. And I thought, wherever we are from, we are here now, and here is good enough to look at without being afraid like that. He snorted and his collar squeaked, and that was the only time I felt a small meanness lift inside me like a hot bubble, but it popped at the ceiling because the doctor came and said my name and put his hand on my shoulder like a man puts a hand on a fence post to steady himself. We had the paper in the city with the headline my mother didn't like, because it had the words missing link in it, and she said missing things make you hungry and it's not good to be hungry for sulfur. The paper loved that phrase ape man because it fills a mouth so close to something unkind, but the doctor, he was careful, he just said early human. A cousin. A little person in the way people can be little and still entirely people. He told me, sitting with his tea, that it wasn't a ladder, it wasn't one thing turning into another like ticks on a list. It's more like a bush, he said, not like a line. Branches grow, some end, some go on. You are on one twig and you look over and see an old twig that ended and you can still love the twig, you understand? I understood. I grew up later, but I understood then elbow-wise if not knee-wise. He showed me in his notebook a sketch of a branching thing that looked like a colt's hoof, and he drew a leaf and colored it in and said, "This is where we are, and this is not an honor position. It's just a position." My friend Toomey came to town to see his aunt, who baked bread that kept the smell of fire in it. He found me outside the university with my chin up and my eyes on my feet like my father had told me. He laughed at the skeleton in the window even while his eyes were like the baby's all taking. He said his grandmother had liked me when I had visited and said I listened to bones like a hungry boy. This made me proud even though it didn't sound like a compliment. We ate coexisters that dripped syrup down our wrists and made our palms shine and then stick to everything. He scratched at my hat with his finger and said, "I thought you would lose this." I had a piece of bone at home I wanted to give him, a little spiral like a snail, but I had lost it in my bed, the way a bed will swallow all the important things and leave buttons. At night, I had dreams of stone eyes opening. I woke and the room was the room you always wake into, rectangles of light and the little buzz of the night creatures in the walls and the smell of the clay pot of water that always tastes like pot and then when you come to it tastes like water again. I put my hand on my own face without thinking, as if to check the holes were where they are meant to be. It made me think of how a carpenter taps his pockets looking for a pencil he is sure he put there. I felt one day that I had swallowed certain words and they rattled when I walked. I wasn't sure whether to like this. You should know that I cried once, that season, and it was not because of a hurt but because I felt like a string had been pulled out of my middle without any hand doing it. Father had been due home and hadn't come when the train ought to have come, and the little clock in my chest struck all the hours at once and then none. The doctor came by then and asked for my mother in his polite way, and I put my head against the cool of the door and the wood left a mark on my forehead. It was nothing. What happened in the end, Father had been stuck out in a siding because a bushfire needed time to sneeze itself out, and he came a day later, dusty and with his eyelashes white like sugar because of ash. I went upstairs with my little shame and put it under my pillow and promised it I would visit but not too often. When you are a boy you don't have many pockets and so you must choose what you carry. We had a little allotment down the way where my mother scolded seedlings as if they were nephews. She stroked the big leaves and told the big leaves that they were not proof of anything because the fruit could be miserable. She shrugged at the basil and pretended it had disappointed her because no one wants to spoil the basil into thinking it is perfect. I sat on the little wall and ate a green fig we weren't supposed to eat yet, and it punished my mouth with sour in a way I liked. The doctor came by with dirt in his cuticles and said, "I do my best thinking with my hand in the ground." He held the soil up and pinched it and let it fall again and it made a small rain of its own, and he looked for the world like a man having a pleasant disagreement with God. Sometimes we went to the market just to hear voices. The city was a hive then, all kinds buzzing, some people in suit coats wearing their heat like a suit, some with hats like umbrellas, some with no shoes and toes that parted and gripped the ground as if it were a small pet. My mother bought spices in paper twists and when you put your nose in them you could imagine far places, the way you can imagine the sea when you hold a shell to your ear even when you know it's only the sound of your own head. I bought a length of string because I never had enough string, and a length of time if I could have, but that is not how markets work. I had a game I played with myself on tram rides. I would choose someone and guess at their story and then make up why they were wrong in certain small ways and right in others. A woman with a face like a clean stone held a parcel as if it were treasure, maybe it was jam, I decided. A man with a book and a look like he wished the book was the world. A boy with ink on his left hand, so he must write letters to someone on a ship. That day, a man had a newspaper folded to the page with the doctor on it. He had that expression of having thought all the thoughts already and not wanting to do new ones. He tsked at the photograph. The doctor looked very neat in the picture, like he had been cut and pasted onto a cardboard. The man with the paper said out loud to no one, "Ape before humans." What nonsense, and I thought of a little sign painted neatly and hung on a fence that said, "Please, no nonsense," but I didn't have such a sign. I kept thinking how different the rock and the little face had made everything quiet in me, as if someone had put their hand over the mouth of the city. Only my mother's voice could make a noise in my head after that. She said, "Be gentle with that skull when you talk about it. Remember it's a child." I said, "It's a child that died long ago, before we were anybody, maybe before time had its own smell," and she put my hand flat on the table and pressed, "Just a second," and said, "Before mothers had to worry about such words," and her eyes were not watering because of the onions. She had lost a baby once, before me, and I was not meant to know, but I did, because boys know things that make grown-ups think they don't know. We went back to the quarry in a different season when the grass along the road had a little green again that made everything feel like a decision made in our favor. The wind was not so strict. Toomey had grown a finger's length taller, we measured, and his ankle bones stuck out differently, and he had a new pride in how far he could spit. The men were the men still, but one had a new hat and another had a baby. You could see in the way he looked at a spoon. We went to a new face of rock where the road had been persuaded to turn, and we stood in a way that makes your shadow go entirely under you and disappear. The doctor showed me a piece of ostrich eggshell and said, "You can make beads from these and a story from those beads." He pressed it into my palm and said, "Keep a little of the story for yourself." I did. I wrapped the little piece in a page from my sums, because if you hide a thing inside maths, no one will think it is interesting. Toomey's grandmother lived in a house she had rolled her sleeves at and built herself. You could tell by the way each touch held someone's breath. She had calves that told you she could walk far and a face that told you she had already been. She laughed when she saw me as if I had done something funny by standing there. She touched my chin like men in church do when they make you look up and talk to heaven a bit, and then she said to the doctor, "You ask the ground and it answers. Be careful what you ask." He told her he would try to ask only the respectful questions. He told her what the little skull had whispered to him, and she nodded and said in her language words that meant she had known that a long time, but not in the way the doctor meant. Which, when you think about it, is perfect. Back in the lab the skeleton seemed pleased. The skull sat in its holder in a way that made it look like a cabbage. I touched the place at my own head again where the bone curves to meet the base, not so much because it itched but because it drew my fingers. The doctor let me help him clean a little piece that had a smooth curve and the soft light of a thing that has been waited for. The bone was softer than I expected, as if the stone had been pressing on it for so long you could feel the patience in it. He told me a story about when he was a boy and broke a plate and glued it back so well that only his mother and he knew. He said, "Reconstruction is like that. You can make the shape, and you can never pretend it isn't broken, but you can also make it whole in a different way, with your seeing." I took his words and tucked them under my cap for later. That afternoon, while he went to speak to someone important, I stayed and dusted the shelf where he had some plaster casts of other pieces that didn't look like much until you put them together. There's an art that comes with the order of things. I made a little stack of rocks that fit, not like a puzzle, because puzzles are a way of saying someone already knew the answer. No, more like friendship, where you put two things next to each other and decide if they like it. The plaster was chalky and made my hands white, and when I touched my cheeks without thinking I left 2 warrior marks and scared myself when I glanced in the window and saw a ghost boy. I laughed out loud in an empty room and wished for Toomey to see it too. At the zoo, a little later, I stood again in front of a gibbon that moved like a boy on a rope. His arms were too long in the way that makes you think of long stories. He looked at his fingers like they were new to him, and then he plucked a bug from his fur and made his lips tiny around it like a straw. He turned his head and I saw the forward-facing eyes and the way he watched, not the bright bits but the invisible string between the bright bits. I thought of how we make jokes about cousins and how sometimes a cousin is the person you talk to when your parents are too large in their worrying to speak to. I thought of the doctor saying branches and of the bush and of a fire that moves between twigs and saves one and not another, and how maybe the saved one is not worth more, just luckier in that wind. One afternoon, I went with the doctor to a newspaper man's office. The newspaper man had a cigar he didn't smoke but kept in his mouth to move it around like punctuation. He let us sit in chairs that creaked and had more horsehair coming from them than horse had left in them. He asked questions in long sentences that had the answers in them already, and did not like it when the doctor took the questions and ironed them flat. He wanted to write ape before humans because that sings in a headline, and the doctor said, no. No before, as if one thing were made to be a stepping stone and then left. This was someone's everything. I don't know if the man heard it that way. He wanted to talk about missing and links and other chain words. The doctor scratched behind his ear and let him, and later on the way home he looked tired, the way men look when they keep carrying water in a sieve and calling it a bucket, because otherwise you can't eat. Mother said, in 100 years no one will remember the headline, but they will remember who curled up with that soul of a skull and took care of it. I told her she had said something quite beautiful, and she pretended to wipe a tear while actually stifling a yawn. She does that when she wants to tell us we are a little too pleased with ourselves and should not explode. Father said, if the child from the stone could see you all now, and we laughed because we had made a person out of a thing, and if you don't laugh at yourself then you will become a table and people will put hot pots on you without coasters. I wanted to be careful. The way you are when you hold a new kitten and it makes your chest thinner. I held a cast of the endo cast in my hands once, and the weight was odd, not heavy like a hammer but like a mostly full cup that you must not spill. The lines on it were like the lines on a map of streets in a city you've never been to, and you know you'd get lost, and you also know that would be the point. I traced a ridge with my thumb and the doctor said, that line has been argued about already, and I asked him what it meant, and he said no one was allowed to know yet because they had not earned it, and people who think they know the shape of a brain from its shadow do not always deserve cake. The doctor had a pipe he sometimes held but did not light. It made the room smell like intention. He would put it down and forget it in the most obvious places, and I would put it back in his pocket and he would say, "Why are you always putting your hand in my pocket?" And I would say, "Because you keep misplacing your head," and we would keep each other like that. He took off his jacket more often after the stone came into his life, as if his core had warmed. He ate more toast. He poured tea and forgot to drink it and then made a face when he drank it cold anyway because he was too proud to admit to himself that it was his fault. He whistled small things without a tune. I went with Toomey to the menagerie one last time before it moved along. We stood under the baboon's rope and watched him scratch his back in a complicated way. Toomey said, "I would not want to be him," and I said I wouldn't either. He said, "It's a good thing the doctor doesn't want us to be him either," and we agreed that the best part of a good teacher is he doesn't ask you to change what you are into something faulty. Toomey told me his grandmother had laughed at the headlines, he wrote it like that, headlines, and said, "People like to know where to put their feet. Tell them the path is good and they will bake you bread. Tell them there are many paths and they will say you are lost." He kicked a little rock and hit a tin and then balanced the tin on his head and walked with his arms out to the sides like he had always had a tin there, and it was me who was odd with my free head. I tried to draw the skull one day, when no one was around. I took a piece of cheap paper that we use for drafts and a pencil that had been gnawed by someone. I made the line of the brow and the curve of the cheek and the delicate hinge where jaw meets the ear, and I could not do it. The paper didn't like me that day. I turned the paper over and tried again, and then I did something I had not done before. I took a bit of soot from the stove and I rubbed it lightly on the paper, and then I erased where I wanted the light to happen and I drew the dark later. The face came out of the paper like it had been there all along waiting for me to take away the wrong bits. It is a trick I still use. When you make something show by making other things go away, you feel like you are being lazy and clever in the same minute. The doctor found my drawing later and put it in a folder, and the folder got lost under other folders, which is his way of loving you. If I had been brave enough to ask anything of the stone child, I would have asked silly things. Did you laugh sometimes? Did your mother's hands smell like clay from pots or like bread? Did you ever put a stone in your mouth and then taste dirt for hours and not tell anyone? Did you run too fast and fall and some adult say, "You deserved that," even though no one deserves a bruise? Did you love the way the cave hums when you sing? But you cannot ask a stone because stones have no tongues, only inside spaces. The doctor said sometimes even the most foolish questions are all we have to make a bridge, so I asked them anyway in my head and imagined answers that felt true not because of the facts inside them, but because of how my chest felt after. The men who had not wanted to see came to see slowly. They would arrive with their hats and their reasons, and then the skull would look at them without looking because eyes are not required for certain kinds of seeing. They would touch nothing and then touch everything and then step back and put their hands behind their backs because that is how you trick your hands into not doing and you make your hands your prisoners. The doctor stood by and explained again and again and found new ways to put old words so that they would not get tired. He had a sort of patience you can only get from listening to rain at night on a tin roof and counting not sheep but drops. We had the radio on one evening, not the official one. A man down the block had made a set with wires and crystals and it only sometimes worked, and it only sometimes brought us human sounds in